The second year after the Hijrah had arrived. In Medina, the Muslim community was slowly becoming established. The Muhajirin had left their homes in Mecca, while the Ansar had welcomed and supported them. But the conflict with Quraysh had not ended. During Ramadan, the Prophet Muhammad learned that a Quraysh caravan returning from Syria was approaching the region. A small group of Muslims left Medina. They were not expecting to face a huge army. Their original objective was connected to the Quraysh caravan. There were only a little more than 300 Muslims, with limited horses, camels, weapons, and supplies. They traveled through the Arabian desert toward Badr. None of them could have known that this journey would lead to one of the most important events in Islamic history. Far away from Medina, a large Quraysh caravan was traveling through the Arabian desert. The caravan had returned from Syria carrying valuable merchandise. It was led by Abu Sufyan. When news reached him that the Muslims were approaching, he immediately took precautions. He managed to avoid the Muslim force and successfully changed the route of the caravan. The caravan was now safe, but the situation had already changed. A message had been sent to Mecca asking Quraysh for help. The Quraysh responded by preparing a large military force. What had begun as an attempt to protect a trading caravan was now turning into a confrontation. The Muslims were still traveling toward Badr. The Quraysh army was also moving toward the same destination. Neither side could fully know what the coming days would bring. From Mecca, a large Quraysh army began its march. Around 1,000 men prepared themselves for the journey. They had weapons, horses, camels, shields, and military equipment. Compared with the small Muslim force, their numbers were overwhelming. The Quraysh believed that their strength would be enough to settle the matter. But then they received news that the caravan had escaped. The original reason for their mobilization was no longer present. They could have returned to Mecca. Instead, the army continued toward Badr. Meanwhile, the Muslims learned that they were no longer approaching a caravan. They were approaching an army. The Prophet Muhammad consulted his companions. The Muhajirin expressed their support. The Ansar also made it clear that they would stand with the Messenger of Allah. The decision was made. The Muslims would face the Quraysh. The Muslims reached Badr, an area known for its wells and its location along the important route between Mecca and Medina. Their army was small. There were only around 313 companions. They had limited resources, but they carefully prepared their position. Water was especially important in the desert. The companions understood that every practical advantage mattered. The Prophet Muhammad and his companions carefully considered the battlefield. The Muslims established themselves near the wells. They did not know how the coming confrontation would end, but they knew that they had to remain united. Across the desert, the Quraysh army was approaching. Their numbers were far greater. The contrast was striking. A small Muslim force stood at Badr. A much larger army was moving toward them. The greatest test of the young Muslim community was now very close. The two armies finally came face to face at Badr. On one side stood the Muslims of Madinah. On the other stood the powerful Quraysh army from Mecca. The difference in numbers was clear. The Muslims were greatly outnumbered, yet they did not turn back. The believers understood that worldly strength alone does not determine the outcome of every struggle. They had prepared themselves as much as they could. Now they placed their trust in Allah. The battlefield was surrounded by the mountains and open desert of the Hijaz. Banners moved in the wind. Warriors prepared their weapons. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew that a major confrontation was about to begin. For the Muslims, this was more than a military encounter. Their community, their faith, and their future were at stake. The morning of Badr would soon become one of the most memorable mornings in Islamic history. The night before the battle was filled with uncertainty. The Muslims had traveled through the desert and were now facing an army much larger than themselves. Yet Allah gave the believers a special blessing. The Qur'an tells us that Allah caused a feeling of security to overcome them and sent down rain. The rain helped settle the ground and gave the believers relief. While the night passed, the Muslims prepared themselves. Some rested. Others remained watchful. The believers turned toward Allah. They knew that their own strength was limited. Their hope was in their Creator. The Prophet Muhammad continued to call upon Allah for help. The Muslims had done what they could. They had traveled. They had organized themselves. They had prepared their position. Now they placed their trust in Allah. Soon, the darkness would disappear. The sun would rise over Badr, and the two armies would meet. Morning finally arrived. The first light of dawn spread across the battlefield of Badr. The Muslims stood in their ranks. Across from them was the much larger Quraysh army. The atmosphere was serious. The believers knew they were facing a tremendous challenge, but they remained firm. The Prophet Muhammad organized the Muslim ranks and encouraged the companions to remain steadfast. The Quran would later remind the believers that Allah had helped them at Badr while they were weak. This was not a day for arrogance. It was a day for patience. The Muslims understood that victory was ultimately in the hands of Allah. The desert was quiet for a moment. Then the first challenges were made. The opening stage of the battle was about to begin. What happened next would be remembered for generations. Before the armies fully engaged, individual warriors came forward. Among the Quraysh were several prominent men, including Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, Shayba ibn Rabi'ah, and Al-Walid ibn Utbah. From the Muslim side came Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Ubaidah ibn al-Harith. The challenge was accepted. The opening combat began. Hamza and Ali defeated their opponents. Ubaidah was seriously wounded and was carried back toward the Muslim ranks. The individual confrontation was only the beginning. Soon, the wider armies would engage. The battlefield that had been quiet moments earlier was now filled with movement. The companions stood together. They knew that they were fighting under extraordinary circumstances. The Quraysh had come with a much larger force. The Muslims had only a fraction of their numbers, yet the believers remained determined. The Battle of Badr had truly begun. The battle spread across the plain of Badr. Muslim and Quraysh warriors moved against one another. Dust rose from the ground. Shields and weapons clashed. The believers remained together under the command of the Prophet. They were facing a much larger army, but they did not allow fear to destroy their unity. The Quran records that Allah strengthened the believers at Badr. The battle demanded courage and patience. Every companion understood that the situation was serious, yet their faith gave them determination. The Muslims fought with the means available to them while relying upon Allah. Gradually, the strength of the Quraysh began to weaken. Some of their leading men were killed. Their formation began to break. The Muslims continued to stand firm. What had appeared to be an impossible situation was changing. The small army from Medina was gaining the upper hand. During the battle, the Prophet Muhammad turned sincerely toward Allah. The Quran records the believers calling upon their Lord for assistance. They knew that their own strength was limited. Their enemy was larger. Their resources were fewer. But their trust in Allah was greater than their fear. Allah answered their supplication. The Quran tells us that Allah supported the believers at Badr with angels. This was a moment of immense spiritual significance. The Muslims still had to act. They still had to remain disciplined. They still had to stand firm. But they knew that ultimate victory belonged to Allah. Badr, therefore, became a powerful lesson in tawakkul. The believers took the available means, and then they placed their trust in their Creator. The battle continued, and the situation was beginning to turn decisively in favor of the Muslims. As the battle continued, the Quraysh army began to lose its strength. Several of its prominent leaders had fallen. Among them was Abu Jahl, one of the strongest opponents of the Prophet Muhammad. The Quraysh formation began to collapse. The Muslims continued to advance. Their victory was becoming clear, but the believers understood that this was not a moment for uncontrolled revenge. The battle had a purpose. The Muslim community had been threatened, and the believers had stood together to defend themselves. Now, the Quraysh army was retreating. The outcome of Badr had been decided. The small Muslim force had overcome an army far larger than itself. For the companions, this was a moment they would never forget. But the day had also brought sacrifice. Some of their own companions had fallen. Victory and grief now existed together. The Battle of Badr was over. The Quraysh had suffered a major defeat. Many of their men had been killed, and many others had been taken prisoner. The Muslims had achieved their first major military victory, but there was no reason for arrogance. The believers had also lost companions who had stood beside them. Their sacrifice was deeply felt. The battlefield was now quiet. The weapons had fallen silent. The armies that had faced each other only hours earlier were no longer fighting. For the Muslims, Badr had changed everything. They had demonstrated that the Muslim community could defend itself. The Quraysh could no longer treat the Muslims as a weak group of refugees. The victory would have major consequences for the future of Arabia. But the Prophet and the believers also knew that every victory brought responsibility. The next challenge was to decide how the prisoners and the aftermath of the battle should be handled. After the battle, the Muslims had prisoners from the Quraysh army in their custody. The Prophet Muhammad consulted his companions about what should be done. Different opinions were expressed. The matter was serious. The Muslims had won the battle, but victory did not mean that they could act without guidance. The treatment of prisoners became an important matter. Allah later revealed guidance concerning the prisoners and the spoils of war. Some prisoners were eventually released through ransom. The events after Badr demonstrated an important principle. Even when believers have power over their enemies, they remain responsible before Allah. Victory must be followed by obedience. The companions were learning how to deal with the difficult responsibilities that came with establishing a Muslim community. Badr was therefore not only a military event, it was also part of the development of the moral, social, and political life of the early Muslims. After the events at Badr, the Muslims returned toward Medina. They carried the news of a remarkable victory. The small community had faced a much larger army and survived. For the people of Medina, the return of the believers was a historic moment. But the community also remembered those who had died. The victory had come with sacrifice. Badr had changed the position of the Muslims in Arabia. The Quraysh had lost many important leaders. Their reputation had been damaged. The Muslims, meanwhile, had become a force that could no longer be ignored. Yet the believers understood that the victory belonged to Allah. The Quran reminded them that Allah had helped them when they were weak. The return to Medina marked the beginning of a new chapter. The conflict with Quraysh was not finished. More trials would come. More difficult days would follow. But the memory of Badr would remain with the companions forever. The Battle of Badr became one of the defining events in Islamic history. The Quran refers to it as Yawm al-Furqan, the day of Criterion. It was a day when the believers were tested, when sacrifice was made, and when Allah granted them victory. Badr teaches us that numbers alone do not determine success. It teaches us patience. It teaches us unity. It teaches us preparation. And above all, it teaches us reliance upon Allah. The companions did not abandon practical effort. They prepared themselves. They consulted one another. They stood together. And then they placed their trust in Allah. That is the lasting lesson of Badr. Victory should never lead to arrogance. Hardship should never lead to despair. And weakness should never make a believer forget the power of Allah. More than 14 centuries later, the story of Badr continues to remind Muslims of faith, courage, patience, sacrifice, and tawakkul. The battlefield may have become part of history, but its lessons remain alive. Allah is the one who grants victory, and every success ultimately comes by His permission.